Tow that truck. I don't want investors seeing it.
The board invited me here. Some mistakes cost more than money.
Where is he now?
He left the building 10 minutes ago. That man owns everything we need. We can replace the truck. We can pay for everything.
You think this is about a truck? My father built my future in that truck.
Can you tell what's wrong?
The software isn't failing. The sensor is lying.
That's impossible.
$150 million. It's yours today. Take the deal. Walk away.
How many workers lose everything if I do that? I'm not here to take your company. I'm here to save it.
When Elijah Cross pulled his old pickup into the founder's circle, CEO Serafina Kingsley looked at the dented blue truck sitting between gleaming limousines and said, without breaking stride, "Tow that junk. I don't want investors seeing it before the meeting." Elijah said nothing. He collected his toolbox, peeled his guest badge from the dashboard, and walked away while security watched. 10 minutes later, the 40th floor boardroom erupted. The man they had just expelled was not a repairman, not a contractor. He was the sole owner of a $3 billion technology, the only thing standing between Kingsley Mobility and complete collapse. Stay until the end to find out why Elijah came back, and why he refused to save the people who had dismissed him. The morning Elijah Cross arrived at Kingsley Mobility's headquarters in Virginia, a thin drizzle was rolling in off the highway, softening the edges of a skyline built from glass and borrowed confidence. He drove slowly through the main entrance in the Ford F-250 that had belonged to his father. A deep Navy truck with a sun-bleached hood, a cracked side mirror repaired with aluminum tape, and a rear bed that carried more intellectual weight than anything else parked in that lot would ever hold. Tucked inside the bed, secured with custom foam bracing that Elijah had engineered himself, was a mobile thermal simulation rig, a high-resolution heat measurement array, and the only remaining functional prototype of the CrossFlow passive cooling system, a device he had spent the better part of 2 decades refining, patenting, and guarding against the very industry that now needed it most. He had not come to apply for a position, had not agreed to sell anything, and had made that point in writing to every party who reached out before accepting this meeting. He was here for one reason only, to determine whether Kingsley Mobility was worth the risk of a licensing arrangement, and to witness the state of the Aegis battery system with his own eyes before making that decision. The security officer at the main gate found Elijah's name without hesitation in the special guest registry, a short list maintained directly by the board chairman's office, and directed him to park in the founder's circle, the elevated staging area near the executive entrance, because the equipment in the truck was too heavy and too sensitive to be transported from the general visitor lot on foot. Elijah thanked the man, pulled the truck around, backed carefully into the designated space, adjusting the rear axle load by feel before cutting the engine, then stepped out into the drizzle and checked that the bed cover was secure. He stood quietly beside the truck with his hands in the pockets of his canvas work jacket, watching the entrance the way a man watches a door he has stood behind before and learned not to trust. Serafina Kingsley arrived with a group of senior advisors and 3 institutional investors she was personally escorting to a pre-meeting walkthrough of the executive suites, dressed in a charcoal blazer, her posture straight and unhurried, the kind of composure that gets practiced in rooms where no one ever says the word mistake out loud. Her gaze swept the staging area and landed on the blue pickup in a way that did not require additional information. Her expression had already reached a conclusion by the time her heels touched the pavement. She did not ask anyone who owned the vehicle, did not consult the guest log, and did not lower her voice when she turned to the head of security and said, without pausing her stride, "Tow that junk. I don't want investors seeing it before the meeting." Nolan Price, the security director, was already reaching for his radio. Elijah did not raise his voice. He stepped forward calmly, identified himself by name, explained that the vehicle had been cleared through main security at the specific direction of the board, and pointed out that the bed contained calibrated equipment that could not be moved without precise positioning. Serafina's eyes moved from his work jacket to his boots to the truck and back again, and she turned to Nolan with a question that was not really a question. Why was a maintenance worker arguing with the chief executive in a restricted zone? Elijah produced the formal invitation bearing the signature of Preston Hawthorne, chairman of the board, and held it steady without a word. Nolan reached for it, but before he could take it, Gideon Carrington materialized from the side entrance, straightening his cuffs with practiced ease, announcing in a smooth tone that the schedule had been modified, and that certain pre-confirmed arrangements may have shifted, suggesting, without saying so directly, that the letter no longer carried the weight it appeared to carry. The tow truck was called. Elijah told the driver, in the same level voice he had used throughout, that the rear axle must not be the point of lift because the simulation rig inside had been calibrated to a specific horizontal orientation, and any tilt would compromise weeks of preparation. But the driver looked at Nolan, who looked at Serafina, who had already turned away. Elijah did not argue further. He unclipped his guest badge, set it face up on the hood of the truck, and spoke to no one in particular, to the parking lot itself, to the glass building behind him. A company that does not know how to treat someone else's property will never be allowed to touch my intellectual property. He picked up his toolbox and walked toward the exit without looking back. Behind him, Gideon Carrington had gone very still, because those words, delivered without theater in a drizzling parking lot by a man in a work jacket, were the most dangerous sentence anyone had spoken in that courtyard all morning. On the 40th floor, the full board of directors of Kingsley Mobility had been assembled since 8 in the morning. Seated around an oval table, long enough to seat a small government, waiting for a man none of them had ever met, but whose name had appeared in every technical brief, every legal analysis, and every last resort memo produced in the past 6 weeks. The company was 48 hours from a federal review that could terminate a $3.2 billion contract to supply the nation's next generation of electric emergency response vehicles. A contract that represented not just revenue, but the entire narrative of what Kingsley Mobility was supposed to become. The Aegis battery system, the heart of that contract, had been logging thermal anomalies for 4 months, and 11 separate engineering teams had attempted to identify the source of the overheating, without reaching a consensus explanation. Each team had focused on software, on firmware, on thermal management algorithms, and each team had been working from the same set of component specifications, the same certified documentation, and the same quietly incorrect baseline. A technical audit commissioned 3 weeks earlier had surfaced something that no internal team had been authorized to investigate. The original architecture of the Aegis design had been built on a partial derivative of a thermal management framework, developed 20 years prior by a researcher who had since left the company, patented his work independently, and never transferred ownership of the underlying methodology. Kingsley Mobility did not simply need someone to repair the overheating problem. They needed the signature of the man who held the original intellectual property to establish that the entire program was not in violation of a patent that, if litigated, would unwind the contract, the certification, and a significant portion of the company's engineering credibility in a single court filing. Preston Hawthorne noticed the absence first. He asked Audrey Bellamy, quietly, the way powerful men ask questions when they already suspect the answer, whether their guest had been escorted upstairs. Audrey called the reception desk and was told that a man named Elijah Cross had departed the premises following a dispute in the staging area near the executive entrance, so Preston asked for the security footage to be pulled to the main display. The room watched, without a word passing between them, as Serafina pointed at the blue truck, issued her order, turned her back when a calm man in a canvas jacket tried to explain himself, and stood unchanged as a tow hook was attached to a vehicle she had not bothered to identify. When Audrey enlarged the guest file on the main display and the photograph appeared beside the name, Dr. Elijah Cross, founder and sole owner of Crossflow Technologies and all associated patents, Serafina had just walked through the boardroom door, still composed, still certain she was minutes away from a conversation she controlled. Preston Hawthorne did not raise his voice. He asked Serafina which vehicle had been removed from the staging area, and she answered that it was an unsanctioned truck blocking the executive approach lane. Preston placed the contract document on the table in front of her, $3.2 billion in clean black type, and said without inflection, that vehicle was carrying the only thing that can keep this company alive. The silence that followed was the particular kind that does not lift. Board members reached for phones, for glasses of water, for words that did not come, and several left the room at a near run toward the lobby elevator, while others tried to call a number that rang and rang in a jacket pocket being carried, unhurried toward a parking garage 6 blocks away. Gideon Carrington watched from his chair and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Elijah was halfway across the pedestrian plaza on the south side of the building, walking the way a man walks when he has made a decision and settled the account in his own mind. When Preston Hawthorne came through the side exit with Audrey Bellamy beside him and a half-dozen board members trailing behind in various states of discomposure, people who had been seated in a room designed to project authority now standing in the open air in the drizzle, their polished shoes on wet concrete, asking a man in work boots to come back. Preston was direct and did not perform the apology. The instruction to remove the vehicle had been a mistake. The board accepted full responsibility, and every expense associated with any damage would be covered without negotiation. Elijah listened with the patience of someone who has heard institutional regret before and knows the difference between an acknowledgement and a reckoning. He told Preston that the truck could be repaired. It was steel and time, and neither was beyond fixing. What could not be undone by a repair bill was what the morning had confirmed, that in 20 years the organization's instincts had not shifted an inch because a man had arrived with a formal invitation from the board chairman, carrying equipment cleared at the gate, and the first response from the chief executive had been to remove him before the investors could see him. The mechanism was different, a parking lot instead of a conference room, a tow truck instead of a voided contract, but the logic underneath it was the same logic Elijah had spent 2 decades putting behind him. Serafina reached him before the others caught up fully. Her first words were structured like a negotiation. The licensing fee could be increased substantially. A new vehicle could be provided. Additional terms could be discussed. Elijah looked at her with an expression that was not anger and not contempt, but something quieter and more final. The look of a man who has already answered the question she was still learning to ask. And he said, "Do you think the problem here is that I can't afford a new truck?" Serafina opened her mouth and did not speak. Elijah waited. She still did not speak. He told her about the truck without being asked. His father had driven it before Elijah was born, had used it to carry Elijah to a vocational technical school 60 miles outside Richmond. On scholarship mornings, when there was not enough money for a university application, had kept it maintained with the precision of someone who understood that a tool cared for is a tool that returns the care. The first cross-flow prototype, a rough assembly of aluminum channels, copper mesh heat pipes, and borrowed sensor components, had been built in that truck bed over 7 consecutive weekends, with his father handing him tools and asking questions that forced Elijah to explain the physics out loud, which was how he discovered he actually understood them. His father's initials were engraved on the side of the main measurement module. The truck was not a vehicle he could not afford to replace. It was the last object in the world that still carried both of their names. The board continued its appeal, because the stakes were real, and the human cost of a failed contract was not abstract. Workers on assembly lines, engineers who had spent years on the Aegis project, supply chain workers with no knowledge of what had been done in the layers above them. Elijah did not dismiss any of that. He said he would re-enter the building under 3 conditions only. The vehicle had to be located and returned without further handling. All security footage related to the removal order had to be preserved in full, and Gideon Carrington was to have no access whatsoever to cross-flow technical data from that point forward. The third condition shifted the air. Gideon, who had followed the group out, asked Elijah what exactly he was suggesting, and Elijah said he was not suggesting anything. He was simply noting that 20 years earlier, Gideon had already tried to take his work once, and he had no intention of making it easier a second time. Serafina said that sounded like a personal grievance. Elijah told her she should ask her chief financial officer about the payment records tied to a supplier called Carrington Advanced Components. Everett Sloan, standing 3 feet away, went the specific color of a man who has been carrying a secret for long enough that its weight has become ordinary, until the moment someone says its name in public. Elijah did not go back inside the building for the reasons the board assumed. He went back because the CrossFlow prototype was in a damaged truck at a municipal tow facility across the city, and the prototype was the kind of object that could not be recreated from a parts list or a manufacturing order. It was built from components that no longer existed in commercial supply, assembled over a decade and a half of iteration, and its inner calibration carried institutional memory that lived nowhere else. He rode with Audrey and Serafina to the impound yard in a company vehicle, sitting in the back seat without conversation, watching the city move past the window with the detached attention of someone calculating rather than observing. The truck had been lifted from the rear axle, which was exactly what Elijah had warned the driver not to do. The forward section of the test rig had shifted inside its foam cradle, and one of the primary sensor modules, a thin rectangular block with a hand-machined aluminum housing, had cracked along the mounting edge, leaving a fracture line across the faceplate that Elijah ran his thumb along without expression, the way a surgeon checks a wound. Serafina offered to arrange immediate procurement of replacement parts. Elijah explained, without drama, that the components in question had been fabricated by hand between 2004 and 2009, that the alloy specifications were proprietary to his own lab, and that ordering replacements was not an option that existed. She stopped offering and started watching instead. He opened his toolbox on the tailgate and began a systematic damage assessment, working from the outer housing inward, testing each connection with the kind of methodical focus that has no interest in being observed and no patience for interruption. Serafina stood nearby and did not interrupt, and it was the first time she had seen Elijah Cross do anything other than walk away or state a condition. What she saw was a man who operated in a different category than the people she had spent the last decade managing, not faster or louder or more visibly confident, but more precise, more contained, more genuinely unbothered by whether anyone in the vicinity understood what he was doing or why it mattered. On the side panel of the main module, beneath a layer of worn protective lacquer, 2 names had been engraved in block letters, Elijah Cross and Isaiah Cross. Serafina read them once and did not read them again, but she also did not look away from the module for a long moment after. While Elijah worked to stabilize the fractured unit, Audrey passed him a sealed evidence bag containing a single Aegis battery sensor pulled from the Kingsley Parts Archive that morning. One of the components currently installed in every operational unit of the Aegis fleet. Elijah examined the exterior casing, turned it over twice, and paused at a small alphanumeric stamp near the mounting terminal, where the alloy designation did not match the specification on the certification document Audrey had attached to the bag. He connected the sensor to the portable diagnostic interface hardwired into the truck's rear panel and let it run a full thermal cycle simulation, and the result was clear and repeatable. The sensor underreported temperature by nearly 18 degrees Fahrenheit across the high-load range, which meant that every time an Aegis battery pack approached the upper boundary of safe operating temperature, the system's central computer was receiving data that described a pack running cool and stable. The computer did not reduce power. The pack continued to climb. Serafina asked why 11 engineering teams had failed to identify this. Elijah did not make it complicated. Every one of those teams had received their component baseline from the operations division, had accepted the certification documentation as accurate, and had therefore spent their diagnostic hours modifying software to solve a problem that originated in hardware they were never told to question. The fraud had been placed exactly where institutional trust is thickest, inside the paperwork that experienced engineers are trained to treat as already verified. Gideon Carrington had not hidden a crime in the dark. he had hidden it in the last place any reasonable professional would think to look. The realization settled over Serafina in layers, each one slightly heavier than the one before it. Because understanding a deception and understanding your own role in sustaining it are two separate arrivals, and she was working through both of them simultaneously. The severed data cable inside the prototype was not consistent with damage from the tow. The cut was clean, perpendicular to the wire bundle, and the insulation around it bore the compression signature of a cable knife, rather than the irregular tearing of a mechanical impact. Elijah showed it to Audrey without narrating its significance, and Audrey photographed it from 4 angles and did not need to be told what to do next. The impound facility's own security system showed a 7-minute gap in coverage that began approximately 40 minutes after the truck was logged in and ended before the next recorded vehicle entry. A gap that was either a remarkable coincidence or the minimum time required for someone who knew what they were looking for to do what they came to do. Nolan Price pulled the access records for the facility and found that a Kingsley Mobility security badge had been scanned at the pedestrian entrance during that window, belonging to a junior staff member who, when reached by phone, confirmed he had visited the facility and received explicit instructions from a senior member of the operations division to retrieve any equipment that had originated from company property. When pressed for the name of that senior member, he gave it without hesitation, because he had believed, until approximately that phone call, that he was following a legitimate corporate directive. Gideon denied the account entirely, characterizing it as the overreach of an inexperienced employee who had misread informal language, then pivoted to offense with the fluency of a man who has used that particular motion before. Elijah Cross was a former employee with a documented history of conflict with management. Arriving in a moment of institutional vulnerability to manufacture leverage and extract an inflated licensing arrangement under duress, Elijah did not engage the characterization. He asked Audrey to trace the complete payment history between Kingsley Mobility and Carrington Advanced Components going back 4 years, broken out by transaction rather than by aggregate. What the records showed was a pattern so precisely engineered to avoid detection that it was almost a form of artistry. Payments divided across dozens of individual transactions, each one falling below the threshold that required full board authorization, spread across multiple fiscal quarters, routed through 3 intermediate entities before landing in accounts that were not, at first examination, connected to anyone at Kingsley Mobility by name. Almost not connected. Everett Sloan had seen the pricing anomaly 14 months earlier, had flagged it internally in a memo that went to Gideon and to no one else, had received a response attributing the increase to supply chain disruption, and had not followed up. He said this in the conference room at the impound facility's administrative office, in the gray voice of a man confessing to the sin of not asking the second question. Serafina turned toward Everett, with the expression of someone about to direct blame outward, and Elijah stopped her. He said that before Serafina assigned responsibility to her CFO for not pressing harder on a report that went to the one person who controlled its outcome, she might want to account for every quarterly summary she had signed, without reading past the executive overview, because she trusted the operations division to flag anything material. The room did not respond to this. Serafina did not respond to this. She looked at the table for a long moment, and then looked at Elijah, and what she found in his expression was not cruelty and not satisfaction. It was the simple patience of a man who has long since stopped needing anyone's acknowledgement and is delivering a truth because the situation requires it, not because he expects to be thanked for it. He agreed to complete overnight repairs to the prototype under one non-negotiable condition. All diagnostic data generated by the CrossFlow system was to be simultaneously written to an air-gapped external server under Audrey's sole administrative control, with no network connection to any Kingsley Mobility infrastructure. Before the evening was out, Gideon had distributed a private message to 4 board members framing Elijah as a disgruntled former employee, leveraging a crisis to extract equity that could restructure the company's ownership. A message calibrated precisely to the fear of the people most likely to authorize what he needed, and most afraid of what cooperation might cost them. Elijah heard the content of that message summarized secondhand, set down his soldering tool, and said, "You are still asking how much I intend to take, instead of asking how many people your company put in danger." He began packing his tools. Audrey caught the dispatch notification on a secondary monitoring alert she had set up 3 hours earlier, when the audit trail first suggested the operations division had been moving assets outside the normal chain of command. A vehicle equipped with the Aegis battery system, one of the prototype adjacent units used for federal demonstration, had been signed out of the Kingsley facility under a logistics order that bore Serafina's authorization code, and was en route to the federal testing ground for a 7 a.m. inspection, requiring a live performance demonstration under maximum load conditions. Gideon had arranged both possible outcomes to his advantage. If the vehicle passed, the overheating incidents could be characterized as isolated anomalies, and the broader fraud would remain buried. If the vehicle failed catastrophically, the contract termination would trigger an asset liquidation clause that Gideon had already lined up a private equity firm to exercise. Both results put money in his pocket. Neither required him to tell the truth. Serafina attempted to issue a halt order through the operations logistics system, and discovered that the command pathway had been restricted, locked by a dual authorization sequence that had already been completed. The system showed that Serafina herself had provided both authorizations. She had not. Her login credentials had been used, combined with a back-end access key that Gideon had held in his personal files since the system's installation, to create a paper trail that would make any subsequent denial look like either incompetence or deception. It was a trap set from inside the machine room, using tools that no one had thought to audit because no one had thought to distrust the person who installed them. Elijah could have left at that point, with complete moral clarity. He had honored his conditions, provided his analysis, and been treated at every turn as a resource to be extracted rather than a person to be respected. The fraud was documented, the threat was identified, and none of what happened next was his legal or professional obligation. He stayed because there were 2 federal technicians assigned to that test vehicle who would be running a maximum load battery sequence with no reason to distrust their instruments, and because a man who spent 20 years developing a safety system for the purpose of preventing exactly this kind of failure does not watch a preventable failure approach and calculate whether intervening is worth his time. He told the group what he needed: the analog interface panel from the Kingsley Labs' original prototype testing station, a portable induction calibration unit, and access to the truck bed, which contained the only remaining tools capable of generating a real-time thermal correction signal, readable on a handheld display without interfacing with the vehicle's compromised software layer. The setup would not fix the battery. It would make the temperature lie visible, turning the gap between reported and actual into a number any observer could read on a screen the size of a notepad, held at arm's length in plain daylight. Serafina removed her blazer and worked beside him without being asked and without offering opinions about the method, following each instruction with the precision of someone who has decided that the only useful thing she can do right now is exactly what she is told. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, while they were routing a thermal probe through a gap in the truck bed lining, she said that she had always interpreted an old vehicle as evidence of a person who had not succeeded. Elijah said the most dangerous form of prejudice is the kind that has learned to describe itself as professional standards. By the time Audrey located the trust documentation connecting Gideon to Carrington Advanced Components through an intermediary holding vehicle registered in Delaware, and by the time Everett had retrieved 3 years of internal emails showing Gideon explicitly instructing the accounting team to remove Elijah's name from historical research attribution records, the calibration unit was complete and the dawn was beginning to show against the windows. The device could not save the battery. It could only tell the truth about what the battery was doing. That, Elijah had long since learned, was usually enough. The federal testing facility was 40 minutes south, and they arrived in the blue Ford just as the inspection team was completing its pre-run checklist. The Aegis vehicle sitting on the pad, with its systems cycling through initialization under an early gray sky. The credentialing officer at the facility gate found Elijah's name on no approved Kingsley Mobility technical roster, which meant the gate officer could not admit him, which he explained with the apologetic certainty of a person who has been trained to follow procedures and believes, genuinely, that procedures are the whole of the story. The officer looked at the work jacket and the old truck and came to a conclusion that was familiar by now, in the way that certain landscapes become familiar when you pass through them often enough that you stop expecting them to change. Serafina stepped forward before Elijah could respond. She stated, in a tone that had shed every trace of the voice she used to manage impressions in front of investors, that the man standing beside her was the owner of the intellectual property at the core of the Aegis system, that he was present at her direct and unconditional request, and that she would accept personal responsibility for any procedural deviation required to admit him. It was the first time all day that she had used her authority to make a doorway rather than a barrier, and the difference in how it felt was not subtle to anyone watching. Elijah attached the portable thermal display to the Aegis vehicle's external monitoring port, ran a 60-second baseline, and showed the result to the federal inspection lead without commentary. The vehicle's own display read within safe operating range, and the portable unit read a number that was 18 degrees higher in real terms. The lead compared the two displays, looked at Elijah, looked at Serafina, and requested a formal halt to the maximum load phase pending independent verification. He did not raise his voice either. Technical people, in Elijah's experience, rarely needed to. Gideon arrived at the facility 12 minutes later and walked onto the pad with the authority of a man who has spent 40 years treating confidence as a substitute for correctness, stating that an outside individual with no current affiliation to Kingsley Mobility had interfaced with a federal demonstration asset using uncertified equipment, and that the readings produced could not be treated as scientifically valid. The inspection lead asked Gideon to specify which element of the methodology he was challenging. Gideon gestured at the truck. The inspection lead wrote something on his clipboard and did not acknowledge the gesture. Elijah pulled 3 sensors from the sealed spare parts locker that the inspection team maintained on site as part of their independent verification protocol. Sensors drawn at random from the Kingsley supplied inventory, opened in front of witnesses, tested in sequence on the portable unit. All 3 produced the same systematic underreporting. All 3 carried the same supplier lot code on their base stamp. That code traced, in the supplier registry that Audrey had pulled up on her phone, directly to Carrington Advanced Components. Gideon then told the room that Serafina had reviewed and approved the supplier substitution and produced a printed document bearing her signature and the correct date. But Audrey examined it for less than 30 seconds before pointing to a spacing inconsistency in the date field, consistent with a post-signature digital insertion. A formatting error she recognized, because she had approved the docu-template herself and remembered exactly where the automatic field spacing fell. The federal inspection lead suspended the test, invoked the evidence preservation protocol, and notified his agency's contracting division. Kingsley Mobility had 30 days to demonstrate corrective capability and institutional transparency before a final determination would be made. A reprieve built on accountability, not forgiveness, a distinction that Elijah made quietly, and that some people in the room were only beginning to understand the difference between. Gideon returned to the Kingsley headquarters ahead of the others, and moved quickly through the corridors with the efficiency of a man who understands that the window between exposure and consequence is small, and that what happens inside it determines everything. By the time Preston's car was pulling into the garage, Gideon had spoken privately with 5 board members and presented a restructuring proposal. Kingsley Mobility, its reputation damaged and its leadership compromised, should accept an acquisition offer from Ashbourne Capital, a private equity firm whose offer had been prepared with a speed that suggested the negotiations had begun well before any public crisis made the timing convenient, and each board member would retain their equity stake through the transition, their positions protected for a guaranteed period, while the complexity of the current regulatory situation would be absorbed into a broader corporate restructuring, in which inconvenient documentation had a way of becoming difficult to locate. Elijah had no seat on the board of directors, and no corporate title and no institutional standing in that room. He had a set of patents that both sides of the proposed transaction needed to function, and that made him the most powerful unaffiliated person in a building full of people holding titles that had suddenly become less meaningful than they looked on organizational charts. Gideon offered him $150 million, clean, immediate, unconditional, in exchange for a permanent global license with no attribution requirements and a signed statement withdrawing any implication of prior wrongdoing. Elijah let the offer sit in the air for the length of time it took everyone present to understand he was not going to reach for it. Then he laid out his terms. He required the company to self-report the supplier fraud to the Federal Contracting Agency before any external disclosure forced the issue. Voluntary transparency in place of managed narrative. He required a full recall and physical inspection of every vehicle in service or in the distribution chain that carried the compromised sensor batch. He required that no cost associated with correcting the fraud be passed to hourly workers or line employees through benefit reductions, layoffs, or deferred compensation. He required that a portion of the net revenue generated under any future cross-flow licensing arrangement be allocated to a worker equity fund administered by an independent trustee. He required that Gideon Carrington and every senior employee who had knowingly participated in concealing the supplier relationship be removed from operational authority immediately and permanently. He required that the board formally acknowledge, in writing, its collective responsibility for failing to enforce the oversight mechanisms that existed on paper and were not used. That was the full list. A board member said that these conditions, taken together, would cause a significant decline in share price in the short term, and that investors who had committed capital in good faith would suffer real losses. Elijah said that the board was choosing between a managed loss from which a viable company could rebuild, and an unmanaged deception from which no company ever fully recovers, and that the choice had already been made by the people in the room who had signed off on reports they did not read. The only remaining question was whether they were going to own that, or perform surprise. Gideon turned, finally, to the weapon he had been holding in reserve. Elijah Cross had left Kingsley Mobility 20 years ago, after being passed over for a senior research role, and everything happening in this room was the long tale of a grievance carried by a man who believed he had been denied what he deserved. Elijah produced on his phone an email chain from 2 decades prior, in which Gideon had explicitly instructed Elijah to sign a work product assignment transferring full ownership of the cross-flow thermal framework to Kingsley Mobility without attribution. He had not been passed over, he had refused to surrender his work without credit, and he had resigned rather than comply. He had not come here for revenge. He had come because a board chairman had asked him to prevent people from being hurt by technology that originated in his own thinking, and that obligation was the only reason he had walked back through any door today. Serafina looked at the vote sheet on the table, at the investors' names on the call-in screen, at the press statement draft prepared for the version of today where she maintained control by controlling what was said. Then she voted yes. Preston voted yes. One by one, with the specific reluctance of people choosing the correct thing over the comfortable one, the board went around the table. The deletion program Gideon had installed in the primary server infrastructure was designed to be fast and complete, and when it activated, triggered remotely in the 3 minutes of chaos between the vote and its formal recording, it began erasing the financial transaction archive, the supplier correspondence files, the internal audit trail, and every version of the sensor certification documentation stored on the Kingsley network. The secondary server that Audrey had established as an independent backup was hit simultaneously through a backdoor credential that a member of the IT department had provided to Gideon 4 weeks earlier. believing it was needed for a routine infrastructure redundancy test. The screens in the boardroom went dark. The vote had been captured on a separate system maintained by the board secretary's office, but the evidentiary basis for every allegation Elijah had made was disappearing at the rate at which modern storage systems can be instructed to forget. Elijah had not trusted any of it to stay intact. From the moment he discovered the severed data cable in the prototype housing at the impound yard, he had operated on the assumption that someone willing to physically destroy evidence in a parking lot would not hesitate to destroy it digitally when the stakes were higher. The air-gapped drive, built into the truck's bedliner housing, a ruggedized unit he had installed when he first began working with sensitive patent documentation and had never removed, contained a complete offline copy of everything the cross-flow diagnostic system had recorded. The sensor test results, with their time-stamped thermal deviation data, the component lot numbers, and their supplier registry match, the payment routing chain Audrey had pulled, and that Elijah had captured through the diagnostic interface before any of it could be modified. The original research documentation with creation timestamps that predated Kingsley Mobility's derivative work by 6 years, and the communications record showing Gideon's access to the test facility during the window when the prototype cable was cut. Nolan Price had been carrying a quiet weight since the morning, from the moment he had watched a camera replay of himself standing at the edge of a parking lot dispute and choosing not to read a letter that turned out to matter. He walked to the truck, accepted the drive from Elijah's hands, and carried it into the boardroom with the careful deliberateness of a man trying to do one thing right at the end of a day that had not offered him many opportunities. The drive was connected to a clean terminal under Audrey's supervision, with every board member present as witness. Gideon Carrington stood at the edge of the room and watched power drain out of a situation he had spent years engineering without making a sound. Serafina called the Federal Contracting Agency's Compliance Division directly, identified herself by name and title, and began the disclosure. Gideon was suspended from all operational authority pending the opening of an independent investigation. Everett Sloan submitted his resignation in writing before the hour was out and included, attached to the resignation letter, the original memo he had written 14 months earlier, the one that had gone only to Gideon and had never come back. The board vote was formalized and recorded. The building did not shake. No one was arrested in a dramatic sequence. Gideon simply stopped being in charge of anything, and the architecture of lies he had maintained for so long stopped being a structure that could support weight. Serafina stood in the corridor outside the boardroom afterward and asked Elijah what it would take to make right what had been done to the truck. Elijah told her the thing that needed repairing was not located under the hood. 3 months later, Kingsley Mobility completed a full fleet recall, replacing every sensor unit in the Aegis line, under a program administered jointly with the Federal Contracting Agency, and overseen by an independent technical committee that included engineers who had never worked for the company and had no financial stake in its outcome. The company's market valuation dropped sharply in the weeks following the disclosure and recovered partially in the months that followed, slower and on different terms than before. Terms built on the public record of what had happened, and on the documented evidence that the people responsible had been removed, and that the systems allowing it to happen were being rebuilt rather than renamed. Several board members chose not to seek re-election. A technical safety oversight body was established with voting representation from the engineering staff, the assembly workforce, and 2 external safety regulators invited specifically because they owed nothing to the company's financial interests. The Worker Equity Fund received its first allocation from cross-flow licensing revenue on the first business day of the 4th month. Gideon Carrington and 2 associates who had managed the supplier front companies were referred to federal prosecutors on charges that included procurement fraud, contract document falsification, and obstruction of a federal inspection process. Elijah had specified, as part of the licensing terms, that the research attribution records for the original thermal management work be corrected in every internal and external filing where they had been altered, and that the names of the two engineers who had contributed to the early cross-flow framework and whose work had been incorporated without credit into the Aegis design be added to the historical record. That correction was made. It took less time to do than it had taken to undo. Serafina held a company-wide meeting in the main lobby, the same lobby where Elijah had been asked to surrender his guest badge, and did not use the occasion to reframe what had happened into a story about resilience or transformation. She described what she had done in the parking lot, the assumption she had made, and the category of person she had effectively decided, without any investigation, that Elijah Cross belonged to. She apologized to him in front of the full staff without asking him to accept the apology, or to signal that the account was settled. Elijah said that an apology from someone with institutional power matters less as a gesture toward him than as a demonstration to every person in the building, with less standing that the institution was capable of changing its instincts rather than only its language. He had repaired the Ford himself, working through 2 evenings in his own garage, and he declined the offer to display it in the lobby as a symbol of the company's renewal, because it was not a symbol of the company's anything. It was his. He drove it out of the Founders Circle on a clear morning, the engine running with the low, steady confidence of a machine that has never needed to prove itself to anyone. He did not accelerate sharply or look back. He drove the way a man drives when the truck beneath him has never been junk, and when the only person who ever needed to know that had always already known.